The champagne sat untouched on the marble counter, their 5th anniversary gift she'd carefully selected that morning. But her husband's suitcase by the door and the woman emerging from their bedroom, wearing nothing but his shirt, shattered any illusion this night would end in celebration. She'd made her first million at 23, built her first billion by 30, but her husband of 5 years still believed she was merely a supportive housewife who contributed nothing to his family's prestigious legacy. She pressed one hand against her still flat stomach, protecting the 4-month secret she'd planned to reveal tonight. But his cold voice cut through her rehearsed announcement. "Pack your things. I'm in love with someone else, and you need to leave." His mother stood behind him with that familiar sneer of superiority, the same expression she'd worn at last month's gala when she'd announced, "You're nothing, you bring nothing, you are nothing." But neither of them knew the pregnant woman absorbing this cruelty had purchased their entire $10 billion real estate company 3 weeks ago. The company valuation his family celebrated on champagne napkins and embroidered pocket squares, $10 billion in property holdings across major cities, had been mortgaged, leveraged, and quietly sold piece by piece to cover losses they'd hidden from investors. But her anonymous cash injections over 18 months had been the only thing preventing their bankruptcy. His mistress draped herself across his arm possessively, diamond bracelet glinting under the chandelier lights, already measuring their penthouse for new curtains. But the woman she was replacing owned not just this apartment, but every property deed, mortgage, and insurance policy his family had built their 3-generation legacy upon. "You're embarrassing to bring to events," he'd told her last month while his hand rested on his mistress's lower back at the company gala. But the wife he'd left home that night had been negotiating the purchase of every single asset his surname represented. His mother's mockery reached its crescendo as security escorted the pregnant wife toward the elevator. "Crawl back to whatever poverty you came from." But the matriarch didn't realize she was addressing her family's new landlord, creditor, and executioner. The moving truck she'd scheduled would arrive in exactly 1 hour, not to remove her belongings, but to strip the penthouse of every piece of furniture she'd purchased. From a home she legally owned through shell corporations they'd been too arrogant to investigate. The forensic accountants she'd hired 6 months ago had revealed their prestigious empire was hemorrhaging money, every board meeting a performance of solvency, but they'd been too busy planning her humiliation to notice the transfer of power happening in plain sight. The documents in her designer handbag, purchase agreements, foreclosure notices, employment termination letters, would transform their anniversary cruelty into consequences beyond their comprehension. But she simply nodded and walked toward the elevator, with one hand protectively over her stomach. The mistress's laughter echoed through rooms that would be empty within a week. Her confidence built on a throne that no longer existed. But the bank notices arriving Monday morning would teach her that decoration plans mean nothing without ownership. His real estate development career had consumed their marriage for years, every promotion celebrated, while her own billionaire status remained curiously unmentioned. But tonight he finally showed his true priorities with devastating clarity that would cost him everything. When she made that phone call from the lobby, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. The pregnant billionaire who'd been playing a game her opponents didn't know existed would finally make her move. But the world-ending consequences of his mother's mockery and his anniversary betrayal would leave him jobless, homeless, and completely unaware of what he'd just lost. What happens when the family discovers the homeless woman they cast out controls their entire fortune and has been their secret savior for years? How does a pregnant billionaire who made her first million at 23 deliver justice to those who called her nothing while she owned everything? And what price will a man pay when his mother's mockery and his anniversary betrayal cost him not just his wife, but his identity, career, and the $10 billion empire he worshipped, all of which belonged to the woman carrying his child. This story teaches powerful lessons about hidden worth, the danger of assumptions, and how true power moves in silence while others celebrate illusions. You will learn that financial independence should precede romantic commitment, that the people we underestimate often hold our fate in their hands, and how strategic patience in executing justice delivers consequences that emotional outbursts never could. You'll discover why self-worth should never depend on others' validation, how to build wealth systems that function regardless of relationship status, and the devastating reality that taking people for granted creates enemies with nothing left to lose. The narrative reveals why treating people with dignity isn't just moral, it's strategic, because burning bridges with the wrong person can cost you everything 3 generations spent building. The Waterford Crystal Champagne flutes had cost $800, a ridiculous extravagance for glass that would hold liquid for mere minutes. But Isabella Mitchell had learned early in their marriage that her husband preferred expensive gestures over meaningful ones. She'd placed them on the marble counter that morning alongside the vintage Dom Perignon, arranging everything with the precision of someone who'd been dismissed as just a housewife. So many times she'd perfected the performance. The irony wasn't lost on her. The counter, the penthouse, the building itself, all purchased through one of her holding companies 18 months ago, when the Mitchell family's cash flow had turned from concerning to catastrophic. But her husband Derek still signed the rent checks, believing his family's name held power. The positive pregnancy test sat in her purse beside the champagne glasses, wrapped in tissue paper with a card she'd written that afternoon. 4 months along, finally past the dangerous first trimester, but she'd waited for their anniversary to share the news, because Derek had always talked about wanting children when the timing was right. She pressed her hand against her stomach, still flat enough to hide beneath her silk blouse, but the secret growing inside her made everything else feel simultaneously more important and completely irrelevant. Her phone buzzed with a message from her lawyer. All documents finalized, awaiting your signal. Isabella silenced it without responding, but the weight of those words settled over her like armor she'd been forging for half a decade. The sound of the front door opening made her straighten reflexively, but the voices that followed, plural feminine laughter mixed with Derek's, turned her blood to ice water. She'd known about Amber for 7 months, had paid investigators $12,000 for photographic evidence of hotel visits, restaurant reservations, and weekend trips explained away as client meetings, but knowing and seeing were universes apart. The woman who emerged from their bedroom wore Derek's Yale t-shirt and nothing else, her legs bare and her auburn hair deliberately tousled in a way that announced ownership. She was younger than Isabella by perhaps 5 years, but her smile carried decades of practiced cruelty as she surveyed the anniversary setup with obvious amusement. "Oh, this is precious," Amber said, trailing one manicured finger along the champagne bottle's label, but her eyes were on Isabella with the confidence of someone who'd already won. "He told me you still did little housewife things. I didn't believe it." Derek appeared behind her, fully dressed, but carrying the energy of a man who'd just rolled out of bed with someone new, but his expression held no shame, only irritation at the timing. "We need to talk," he said to Isabella, but his hand settled possessively on Amber's hip in a gesture that communicated everything before words could. Isabella's carefully planned speech evaporated, but years of board meetings and acquisition negotiations had taught her that silence often spoke louder than prepared statements. She simply waited, hand moving unconsciously to her stomach again, but Derek's eyes tracked the movement without comprehension. "This isn't working anymore," he continued, his voice taking on the professional tone he used for difficult conversations with contractors. "You've become stagnant. Amber brings something to my life that you can't. Ambition, drive, an understanding of what it takes to build an empire." The laugh that escaped Isabella surprised even her, sharp and genuine, but edged with something that made Amber's smile falter slightly. "An empire," she repeated softly, but the words carried weight Derek was too self-absorbed to notice. "Tell me, what empire exactly?" Before he could respond, the click of heels on marble announced another arrival. Victoria Mitchell, Derek's mother, swept into the penthouse with the imperious energy of someone who'd never been denied entry anywhere, but her smile turned venomous when she spotted Isabella. "Still here?" Victoria's tone could have frozen the champagne without ice, but she moved to stand beside her son with the solidarity of shared cruelty. "I told Derek weeks ago this was overdue. You contribute nothing to this family, Isabella, absolutely nothing. You're an embarrassment at events. You have no career, no connections worth mentioning, no family wealth." She paused, her pearl necklace catching the light. "You're essentially a burden we've been carrying out of Derek's misplaced sense of obligation." The words were designed to destroy, delivered with surgical precision by a woman who'd perfected the art of elegant cruelty over 6 decades. But Isabella felt something shift inside her, not breaking, but hardening into diamond-sharp clarity. "Pack your things," Derek said, and his suitcase by the door suddenly made perfect sense. "Amber is moving in this weekend. My lawyer will send you separation paperwork, but let's be honest. You'll walk away with whatever prenup we signed. This penthouse, the lifestyle, the Mitchell name, none of that was ever really yours." Isabella's phone buzzed again in her purse, her CFO this time confirming the Monday morning press release was ready. But she ignored it. Instead, she looked at the 3 people who'd orchestrated her public humiliation: her husband, his mistress, his mother. They stood together like a portrait of casual cruelty, but none of them noticed the woman they were destroying had been systematically dismantling their world for months. "You're right," Isabella said quietly, reaching for her purse and the documents inside that would change everything. But her hand hovered over the champagne glasses. "One last time. This was never really mine." The smile she gave them promised nothing, but the phone call she'd make from the lobby would deliver everything they'd spent generations building directly into her hands. Hands they'd just forced empty, unaware she'd been holding their fate all along. The elevator descended 42 floors, but Isabella's mind traveled back 7 years to a coffee shop in Boston, where she'd first met Derek Mitchell, back when she was still Isabella Chen, the venture capitalist who'd just closed a $60 million biotech acquisition before her 30th birthday. He'd been charming then, genuinely impressed by her work rather than threatened by it, but somewhere between the engagement and the wedding, his admiration had curdled into something that required her diminishment for his comfort. She'd sold her first software company at 23 for $18 million, but Derek had never asked about it, had never asked about anything really, beyond whether she'd picked up his dry cleaning or confirmed dinner reservations with clients whose contracts she'd later discover were funded by her anonymous investments. The venture capital firm she'd built to 70 employees had been too demanding for marriage, he'd suggested during their engagement, but what he'd really meant was too visible, too successful, too much evidence that she didn't need the Mitchell name for anything except the love she'd foolishly believed was real. So she'd stepped back, restructured her holdings into shell corporations and blind trusts, let her Harvard MBA gather dust while she played the role of supportive wife at galas, where Victoria introduced her as Derek's better half, with a tone that implied she was actually the lesser. But stepping back wasn't the same as stepping down, and the past 5 years had taught Isabella that invisible power moved more efficiently than celebrated authority. Her phone rang as the elevator reached the lobby. Marcus Brennan, her CFO, whose nervous glances at the company gala 6 weeks ago had confirmed what her forensic accountants had already discovered. She answered on the first ring, but her voice carried none of the tears still drying on her cheeks. "The moving company arrives in 40 minutes, Isabella said, watching through the lobby's glass walls as her driver pulled up in the Mercedes she'd purchased through a Delaware LLC. Everything I own comes out of that penthouse tonight. Everything they think they own becomes theirs to explain to creditors tomorrow. Isabella, are you certain about the timeline? Marcus's voice carried concern that transcended professional obligation, but they'd worked together for 8 years, and he understood her decisions were never impulsive, only carefully delayed for maximum impact. Once we file the ownership transfer documents and the foreclosure notices, there's no walking this back. The press will detonate this by noon Monday. They just kicked a pregnant woman onto the street, Isabella said softly, but her free hand moved to her stomach with protective fury that surprised her with its intensity. His mother called me nothing. He called me stagnant. His mistress is measuring my home for new curtains. So yes, Marcus, I'm certain about the timeline. In fact, let's accelerate it. The lobby security guard, James, who'd worked this building for 3 years and always held the door for her, approached with obvious distress written across his face. But Isabella raised one hand to stop his apology before it began. You were following orders, she told him gently, though his role in her humiliation would be addressed through different channels. But tomorrow you'll be following mine. Mrs. Amber Hartwell and Mr. Derek Mitchell are to be denied building access, effective immediately. Mrs. Victoria Mitchell's penthouse on the 38th floor. I assume you know it? James nodded slowly, confusion spreading across his weathered features, but years of working luxury buildings had taught him that rich people's drama often came with surprising revelations. Foreclosure proceedings begin Monday morning, Isabella continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was orchestrating. I own this building, James. I've owned it for 18 months. Every apartment, every parking space, every gilded fixture in that lobby behind you. The Mitchell family has been living in my properties, working in my offices, and building their empire on my capital since their accounts went negative in March 2 years ago. She watched comprehension dawn across his face, shock, then something like awe, but she wasn't finished. The company his grandfather built, Mitchell and Associates Real Estate Development, their $10 billion valuation that Victoria mentions at every charity luncheon? Isabella's smile held no warmth, only the calculated precision of someone who'd been playing chess while her opponents were still learning checkers. Inflated by properties they no longer own, developments built with loans they can't repay, and contracts secured by my venture capital injections. The forensic accountants I hired found embezzlement, fraud, falsified reports to investors, enough federal violations to occupy prosecutors for years. Marcus's sharp intake of breath crackled through the phone, but he recovered quickly. When do you want the SEC filing submitted? Monday morning, 9 a.m. sharp, Isabella said, sliding into her Mercedes but keeping her eyes on the building's top floors, where lights still blazed in the penthouse she'd just been evicted from. Let them have their weekend celebration. Let Amber redecorate. Let Victoria toast her son's upgrade. But Monday, they wake up to a world where their name means nothing. Their money doesn't exist. And the pregnant woman they mocked controls whether they face criminal charges or merely financial devastation. Through the car window, she could see Derek on their balcony, his balcony now for approximately 60 more hours, with Amber pressed against him in celebration of their victory. But neither of them noticed the moving trucks pulling up to the building's service entrance, or the legal documents being filed electronically across 3 states simultaneously. Marcus, Isabella said as her driver pulled away from the curb, send the full acquisition history to my lawyer. Every anonymous cash injection, every debt purchase, every shell company transfer. I want documentation that proves I've been their silent partner, no, their silent savior for 22 months. And then I want documentation of every insult Victoria delivered at family dinners, every dismissive comment Derek made about my lack of contribution, every moment they treated me like I was worthless. Planning something specific? Marcus asked, but his tone suggested he already knew. I'm planning to teach a very expensive lesson about the difference between appearing powerful and actually holding power, Isabella said, and for the first time that night, her smile reached her eyes. They wanted me to crawl back to poverty. Instead, I'm going to show them what poverty looks like when you've spent 3 generations building castles on borrowed money. Money you borrowed from the woman you just threw away. Saturday morning arrived with sunshine that mocked the darkness. Isabella felt settling over the Mitchell family's future, but she watched it from her new penthouse across town, a property she'd purchased under her own name 2 years ago, back when she'd first suspected Derek's loyalty might be negotiable. The space was smaller than the marital home, but entirely hers, decorated with the modern art Derek had called pretentious, and the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves he'd dismissed as excessive. But every choice reflected the woman she'd buried beneath his expectations. Her phone had been vibrating since 6 a.m. with messages from her network, investors, board members, former colleagues who'd watched her disappear into matrimony and had been waiting for her return. But the message that made her pause came from an unknown number with a photo attachment. Amber, lounging in Isabella's former bedroom, wearing Isabella's silk robe, posting to social media with the caption, "New beginnings in paradise," or "Blessed, upgrading, moving up." The rage that surged through Isabella was white-hot and clarifying, but years of boardroom warfare had taught her that anger deployed strategically cut deeper than emotional outbursts ever could. She forwarded the image to Marcus with a simple instruction: add social media documentation to the harassment file. Her IP address shows she's posting from property she's illegally occupying. The weekend stretched before the Mitchell family, like a carnival they didn't know was built over a sinkhole. But Isabella had orchestrated every hour of their remaining joy with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra toward its final devastating note. She'd timed the foreclosure notices to arrive Monday at 9 a.m., after the morning news broadcasts, but before the stock market opening bell, ensuring maximum media coverage of the family's spectacular collapse, but giving them these last hours of blissful ignorance felt less like mercy and more like the building of potential energy before an explosive release. Her laptop displayed 12 open tabs, SEC filing confirmations, bank foreclosure documents, employment termination letters for Derek and 17 other Mitchell and Associates executives, and the press release that would reframe 5 years of her silence into a narrative of strategic positioning rather than submissive absence. But the tab that held her attention showed the building security footage from last night. Victoria's hand physically shoving her pregnant daughter-in-law toward the elevator, Derek's cold dismissal, Amber's triumphant laughter, all captured in high definition from cameras Isabella had installed for security purposes 8 months ago when the investigators first confirmed Derek's infidelity. A knock on her door interrupted her review of the footage, but the face that appeared through the peephole made her breath catch. Her younger sister, Rachel, whom she'd kept at a distance from the Mitchell family drama for reasons that were about to become clear. "I saw the news about you and Derek on Amber's Instagram," Rachel said the moment Isabella opened the door, her expression fierce with protective rage that reminded Isabella why family mattered more than marriage vows. "Please tell me you're not just accepting this. Please tell me the sister who negotiated a $70 million acquisition while recovering from appendicitis isn't going to let these people—" "I own everything they have," Isabella interrupted quietly, but the words landed like a grenade in the calm of her new living room. "Their company, their buildings, their cars, their reputation. I've been systematically acquiring it all for 22 months, while they called me worthless. Monday morning, the world discovers that the stagnant housewife Derek divorced was actually the silent majority shareholder who'd been preventing their bankruptcy since their CFO started embezzling funds to cover their lifestyle expenses. Rachel's mouth opened, closed, then opened again, but no sound emerged for several seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice carried awe mixed with something darker. "You've been planning this. This whole time you knew he was cheating. You knew they were broke. You knew—" She paused, eyes widening further. "You knew you were pregnant when he kicked you out last night, didn't you?" Isabella's hand moved to her stomach again, the gesture that had become unconscious over the past 4 months, but this time it carried different weight. "I found out 12 weeks ago. Same week I finalized the purchase of their flagship property downtown, the one Derek's grandfather built in 1952, the one they've used in every marketing campaign for 3 generations. I own it through a trust fund they never investigated because they were too busy assuming I came from nothing." "What are you going to do?" Rachel asked, but her tone suggested she was asking about scope, not intent. "Monday morning, Derek wakes up unemployed, fired from a company I control through majority shares purchased when their stock price collapsed last quarter," Isabella said, pulling up a document on her laptop that outlined the systematic destruction she'd architected. "Victoria wakes up in an apartment I'm foreclosing on, with credit cards I'm canceling, facing questions about the charity funds she's been skimming for years, something my forensic accountants discovered while investigating the company's broader fraud. Amber wakes up as an accomplice to illegal occupancy and potentially worse, depending on how deeply she was involved in Derek's business dealings." Rachel settled onto the sofa, her expression shifting from shock to something resembling respect. "You're not just divorcing him, you're erasing him." "I'm revealing him," Isabella corrected, but her voice carried steel that hadn't been there during 5 years of playing the diminished wife. "Everything they claimed to be was built on money they didn't have, reputation they didn't earn, and power they borrowed from the woman they treated like nothing. Monday morning, the truth comes due." Her phone buzzed with another message, this time from her lawyer confirming the media list for Monday's press conference, but Isabella's attention was caught by the live security feed from her former building showing Derek and Amber leaving for brunch, his arm around her waist, both of them laughing at something on his phone. Victoria emerged minutes later in designer clothes Isabella's anonymous payments had funded, climbing into a Mercedes Isabella's holding company had purchased for the building's executive use. They looked wealthy, powerful, untouchable, everything Isabella had appeared not to be when security escorted her out of that same building 16 hours ago, but appearances had always been the Mitchell family's greatest asset and their fatal vulnerability. They'd built empires on borrowed money, reputations on inflated achievements, and authority on the assumption that no one would ever audit their claims. But Isabella had spent 22 months auditing everything, and Monday morning would be their final exam. One they'd been failing since the moment they decided the quiet woman funding their lifestyle was too insignificant to respect. "Do you feel guilty?" Rachel asked quietly, watching her sister's face for signs of the woman she'd known before Derek Mitchell had convinced her to disappear. Isabella considered the question honestly, weighing the pregnancy hormones that occasionally made her weep against the cold satisfaction of consequences perfectly aligned with crimes. "I feel protective," she finally said, hand on her stomach again. "This baby deserves a father who values people, who builds honestly, who understands that power comes from what you create, not what you take. Derek was never going to be that father. He proved it last night when he chose cruelty over curiosity, never even asked why I was touching my stomach, never wondered if the champagne was celebrating something beyond our anniversary." "So you're not doing this for revenge," Rachel said slowly, understanding crystallizing. "You're doing this for For everyone who gets called nothing by people who are nothing without them, Isabella finished. But her eyes were on the security footage showing her former family celebrating a victory that would evaporate in 48 hours. Monday morning, the world learns what happens when you mistake silence for weakness and absence for insignificance. The pregnant woman they threw away was the only thing holding their empire together. She closed her laptop, but the decision was made. The course was set, and the weekend countdown had already begun. Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability, but Isabella had been awake since 4 a.m., preparing for the systematic dismantling of everything the Mitchell family had pretended to be. Her laptop displayed 17 browser tabs, each one a different news outlet that would simultaneously publish the story at 9 a.m. sharp. But the tab holding her attention showed the live security feed from her former building where Derek's alarm would be going off in approximately 4 minutes. The pregnancy nausea hit harder this morning, or perhaps it was just anticipation dressed in hormonal clothing, but Isabella kept saltine crackers beside her coffee and worked through the discomfort with the same discipline that had built 3 successful companies before her 35th birthday. The baby kicked for the first time yesterday, barely a flutter, easy to miss. But she'd been alone in her new penthouse when it happened, and the solitude had crystallized her resolve in ways Derek's cruelty never could. Her phone buzzed at exactly 8:47 a.m., Marcus confirming the SEC had received their filing, her lawyer confirming the press conference room was ready, and her head of security confirming that building access had been revoked for Derek Mitchell, Amber Hartwell, and Victoria Mitchell effective 8 a.m. But the message that made her smile came from James, the security guard who'd escorted her out Friday night. Mrs. Mitchell just arrived at the lobby. She's being informed her keycard no longer works. She's demanding to speak with building management. Should I tell her management is you? Isabella typed back quickly, not yet. Let her demand. Let her threaten. Record everything. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The drive across town felt longer than usual, but Isabella used the time to review her speaking notes for the press conference that would reframe the entire narrative. Not a bitter wife seeking revenge, but a successful businesswoman who'd discovered fraud, stepped in to prevent investor losses, and ultimately been forced to reveal her involvement when the family she'd been protecting turned their dysfunction toward her unborn child. The story was true, legally bulletproof, and devastatingly sympathetic in ways the Mitchell family's version could never counter. Her Mercedes pulled up to the building at 8:58 a.m., 2 minutes before the news broke. Perfect timing. But the scene in the lobby exceeded even her carefully managed expectations. Victoria Mitchell stood near the reception desk in last season's Chanel, her face crimson with rage as she berated James about incompetence and lawsuits and knowing who she was dealing with. But the stack of foreclosure notices in James's hand told a different story about who was dealing with whom. Derek appeared through the revolving doors 30 seconds later, Amber trailing behind him with confusion replacing Friday night's confidence, but his expression when he spotted Isabella standing calmly near the elevator bank was worth every dollar she'd spent on forensic accountants and legal fees. "What are you doing here?" Derek demanded, striding toward her with the aggressive energy of a man accustomed to intimidating his way through obstacles. But Isabella's security detail, 3 former Secret Service agents she'd hired over the weekend, materialized between them with practiced efficiency. "I'm here for a board meeting," Isabella said quietly, pulling out her phone to show him the news alert that had just posted across 17 major outlets simultaneously. Tech billionaire Isabella Chen reveals secret ownership of Mitchell & Associates. Amid fraud investigation, pregnant entrepreneur was anonymous savior of failing real estate empire. She watched the color drain from Derek's face as he read, but Victoria's shriek of "What is this?" provided the soundtrack to his comprehension collapsing. Amber had her phone out, scrolling through the articles with dawning horror, but Isabella's attention was on her husband, former husband. The papers had been filed at 8 a.m. as reality rewrote everything he'd believed about their marriage. You. Derek's voice cracked on the single syllable, but Isabella heard 5 years of dismissiveness shattering against the truth he'd been too arrogant to investigate. You're Isabella Chen, the Isabella Chen who sold Soft Dynamics for $80 million. You built Chen Ventures, you've been... He couldn't finish the sentence, but the security footage playing on the lobby's display screen finished it for him. The screens, normally showing building announcements and weather, now displayed edited clips from Friday night. Victoria shoving Isabella toward the elevator, Derek's cold, "Pack your things," Amber's mocking laughter, the champagne glasses sitting untouched while they celebrated destroying a pregnant woman's life. The footage played on loop, but the caption beneath told the story Isabella had scripted. Family's response when secret billionaire benefactor revealed pregnancy. Every article mentions "I'm 4 months pregnant," Isabella said, her voice carrying across the lobby where a growing crowd of building residents and employees had gathered, drawn by the commotion but staying for the spectacle. Every article mentions that I purchased your company 22 months ago, when your CFO's embezzlement nearly bankrupted you. Every article mentions that I've been anonymously funding your lifestyle, your mother's apartment, your mistress's car. She gestured toward Amber. Everything you claimed to own was borrowed from the woman you kicked out for being worthless. Victoria lunged forward, but Isabella's security moved faster, and the matriarch found herself restrained while her carefully constructed world evaporated in real time across every screen in the lobby. "You can't do this," Victoria hissed, but the foreclosure notices James handed her documented exactly what Isabella could do and had already done. "I already did it," Isabella corrected gently, but her hand moved to her stomach in the gesture that had become protective instinct. "I gave you 5 years to see me. I gave you 22 months of financial salvation without recognition. I gave you Friday night to choose differently, to ask why I was touching my stomach, to wonder about the champagne I'd carefully selected, to show even minimal curiosity about the woman you lived with. Instead, you chose cruelty." Derek's phone was ringing continuously. Board members, investors, his father calling from the retirement community in Arizona, but he ignored everything except the woman standing before him, who'd been invisible until the exact moment she chose to be seen. "The baby," he said, the words emerging like they were being dragged from somewhere deep and previously inaccessible, but Isabella's expression didn't soften. "We'll have a mother who teaches them that power isn't loud, it's patient," she said, turning toward the elevator that would take her to the top floor, to the executive offices she owned, to the board meeting where Derek's termination would be formalized, to the press conference where she'd explain how protecting investors from fraud had required revealing her identity as the Mitchell family's silent partner. "We'll have a mother who shows them that being called nothing by people who are nothing without you isn't an insult, it's intelligence gathering. And we'll have a mother who proves that the best revenge isn't emotional. It's systematic, legal, and absolutely irreversible." The elevator doors opened, but before Isabella stepped inside, she turned back to face the 3 people who'd orchestrated her public humiliation. 72 hours ago, they stood in the lobby of a building she owned, wearing clothes she'd funded, facing consequences she'd architected, but the pregnant woman they'd dismissed had one final lesson to deliver. "You taught me that love without respect is worthless," Isabella said, her voice carrying the strength of someone who'd spent 5 years preparing for this exact moment. "So I'm teaching you that respect without substance is invisible. I was always substantial, Derek. You just never bothered to look." The elevator doors closed on 3 faces frozen in various stages of comprehension, but Isabella's reflection in the polished brass showed someone different than the woman who'd been escorted out Friday night. not defeated, not destroyed, but finally completely triumphantly visible. Her phone buzzed with messages from investors wanting back into her portfolio, former colleagues requesting meetings, and one from Rachel. Watching the press coverage. "You're trending #1 worldwide. The baby is going to know their mother is a legend." But the message that made Isabella's carefully controlled composure finally crack came from an unknown number. A short video of Derek being escorted from the building by police, not for the fraud charges yet under investigation, but for attempting to force entry into a property he no longer had any legal right to access. The man who'd owned everything Friday night was officially jobless and homeless by Monday afternoon. But the pregnant woman he'd discarded was teaching the world what happens when you mistake quietness for weakness. The board meeting lasted 17 minutes, just long enough to formalize Derek's termination, approve the fraud investigation cooperation, and confirm Isabella's transition from silent partner to public CEO. But the press conference that followed would replay across news networks for weeks. The pregnant billionaire who'd been called nothing stood before cameras explaining how she'd protected an empire while being dismissed by the family she'd saved. And the world responded with fury directed at the Mitchell family and fascination with the woman who'd played the longest game and won everything. By sunset Monday, Derek's LinkedIn showed unemployed. Victoria's penthouse was empty of personal belongings, and Amber had deleted every social media account after harassment from thousands who'd seen the security footage. But Isabella sat in her new penthouse with her hand on her growing stomach, teaching the baby their first lesson. That true power doesn't announce itself. It simply moves systematically and unstoppably until the moment's silence becomes the loudest statement anyone has ever heard. The nursery overlooked Central Park, floor-to-ceiling windows framing autumn leaves that burned gold and crimson against an impossibly blue October sky, but Isabella's attention was focused on the tiny human sleeping in her arms. 7 pounds, 3 ounces of perfect possibility wrapped in organic cotton that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Sophia Chen Mitchell had her father's dark hair but her mother's determined chin, and in the 6 days since her birth, she'd already mastered the art of commanding a room simply by existing. The irony wasn't lost on Isabella that she'd kept Derek's surname for her daughter, not out of sentimentality but strategic positioning, because Sophia deserved to reclaim what that name should have meant: integrity, hard work, genuine achievement rather than borrowed glory. The Mitchell family legacy would be rebuilt through this child, but this time constructed on foundations that couldn't crumble when scrutiny arrived. Her phone sat silenced on the side table, but the notifications had been accumulating since dawn. Messages from Rachel asking about feeding schedules, from Marcus requesting approval on the Q4 projections that showed Chen Ventures had tripled in value since she'd returned to public leadership, and from her lawyer confirming that the final divorce decree had been signed by a judge that morning. 5 years of marriage dissolved into legal documentation, but the baby in her arms represented everything that union should have produced. New life built from hard lessons and harder choices. The apartment's intercom buzzed softly, her assistant's voice gentle with awareness that a newborn slept nearby, but the message made Isabella's eyebrows rise with something between surprise and vindication. "Derek Mitchell is in the lobby requesting to see you. He says he has something important to discuss regarding Sophia. Security is awaiting your instructions." 6 months ago, Isabella would have refused immediately, but motherhood had softened certain edges while sharpening others, and curiosity won over residual anger. "Send him up," she said quietly, transferring Sophia to the bassinet beside her chair with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent 6 days learning to function on 90-minute sleep cycles. "But have security wait in the hallway." Derek appeared at her door 3 minutes later, looking nothing like the man who'd kicked her out on their anniversary. his tailored suits replaced with off-the-rack business casual, his confident stride diminished to something more cautious. But his eyes, when they landed on the bassinet, held something Isabella hadn't seen in years, genuine humility mixed with devastating regret. "She's beautiful," he said, keeping his distance as though approaching too quickly might shatter the fragile permission Isabella had granted by allowing this visit. "I saw the birth announcement, Sophia Chen. Mitchell, you kept my name." "I kept your name for her, not for you," Isabella corrected, but her tone lacked the sharpness that would have accompanied those words 6 months ago. "She deserves the choice to reclaim what Mitchell should have meant. Before your family spent 3 generations building reputation on borrowed money and inflated accomplishments." Derek flinched but didn't argue, and his acceptance of the criticism told Isabella more about his transformation than any apology could have. He moved slowly toward the bassinet, but stopped when Isabella's posture stiffened, waiting for explicit permission that she granted with a small nod. "I've been working construction," Derek said quietly, his eyes on his sleeping daughter, rather than the woman who'd destroyed everything he'd falsely believed he'd built. "Real construction, carrying materials, mixing concrete, learning what my grandfather actually did before his company got successful. The crew doesn't know who I am. They just know I show up on time and work hard." "That must be quite the adjustment," Isabella observed, but there was no mockery in her voice, just clinical assessment of a man trying to rebuild from rubble she'd deliberately created. "I deserved worse," Derek said, and the words carried weight that suggested months of therapy or deep personal reckoning or both. "The fraud charges, the public humiliation, losing everything. I deserved all of it. But Sophia," his voice cracked on their daughter's name, "she deserves better than a father who only learned basic human decency after losing everything." Isabella studied him carefully, looking for manipulation or self-pity, but found only exhausted honesty from someone who'd been forced to confront reality without the cushion of unearned wealth. "What do you want, Derek?" "Nothing," he said immediately, then corrected himself with visible effort toward precision. "That's not true. I want to be part of her life, if you'll allow it. Not now, I haven't earned that yet, but someday when I've built something real instead of borrowed, when I can teach her actual lessons about integrity instead of just cautionary tales about consequences." The request was so reasonable, so carefully devoid of entitlement, that Isabella found herself considering what 6 months ago Isabella would have rejected instantly. Sophia stirred in her bassinet, tiny fist escaping her swaddle, and both parents moved instinctively toward her before Derek caught himself and stepped back. "My lawyer will draw up custody parameters," Isabella said slowly, watching relief and gratitude wash across Derek's face in waves that would have been pathetic if they weren't so genuine. "Supervised visits starting in 6 months, contingent on continued employment, therapy attendance, and absolutely zero contact with your mother or Amber Hartwell. Sophia doesn't need their toxicity anywhere near her childhood." "Victoria's in Arizona," Derek offered quietly, sitting in the chair Isabella gestured toward, but maintaining careful distance from both mother and child. "Moved in with my father after the foreclosures finalized." "Amber," he paused, and something painful crossed his features. "I testified against her in the fraud trial. She'd been helping the CFO embezzle funds, using pillow talk to get access codes and account numbers. She's serving 18 months federal prison, but the judge was lenient because she cooperated with prosecutors." Isabella had known about Amber's sentencing, had received updates from the federal prosecutor handling the case, but hearing Derek acknowledge his role in her conviction suggested accountability she hadn't expected him capable of reaching. "And you?" Isabella asked, because the question mattered more than she'd anticipated. "The investigation cleared you of criminal charges, but what have you learned besides how to mix concrete?" Derek was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on Sophia rather than Isabella, But when he spoke, his words carried the weight of someone who'd been forced to examine every assumption that had previously structured his worldview. I learned that I spent 5 years married to someone extraordinary and never bothered to know her. I learned that my family's empire was built on exploitation disguised as legacy. I learned that the woman I called stagnant had accomplished more by 30 than I'll probably achieve in a lifetime, and that my first response to her excellence was to diminish it because my ego couldn't handle partnership with someone more successful. He turned to face Isabella directly, and the man looking at her bore little resemblance to the husband who'd casually destroyed their marriage for someone younger and less threatening. I learned that being called nothing by you would have been the kindest thing you could have said, because nothing would have been closer to accurate than what I believed I was. And I learned, his voice dropped to barely above a whisper, that the baby you were touching your stomach to protect that night was mine, and I never even asked, never wondered, never cared enough to be curious about the woman I'd promised to build a life with. Tears tracked down his face, quiet, unceremonious, but Isabella felt no satisfaction in his obvious pain, only tired acknowledgement that some lessons could only be learned through complete destruction of previous certainty. Sophia will know her father, Isabella said finally, making the decision that would shape her daughter's life in ways she couldn't fully predict, but felt instinctively was right. But she'll know the father you're becoming, not the man you were. She'll learn that people can change when consequences force honesty, but that change doesn't erase what came before, it just creates possibility for what comes after. Derek nodded, wiping his face with the back of his hand, but his eyes remained on the bassinet where Sophia slept peacefully, unaware she was the catalyst for redemption her father might not have sought without her existence. "Thank you," he said simply, standing slowly as though aware his welcome had reached its natural conclusion. "For giving me the chance to be better, for not erasing me from her life entirely, which would have been justified, for—" He paused, struggling with words, "for being the kind of person who could have destroyed me completely, but chose to leave room for something else." "I didn't do it for you," Isabella said, walking him toward the door, but keeping her body between Derek and the nursery in maternal instinct that transcended their complicated history. "I did it for her, because she asked me last night, in her own newborn way, whether her father was worth knowing. And I realized I couldn't answer that question honestly anymore because you're not who you were 6 months ago." The elevator doors closed on Derek's tearful gratitude, but Isabella returned to the nursery where Sophia had woken and was making the preliminary sounds that would escalate to demanding if not immediately addressed. She lifted her daughter carefully, settling into the rocking chair that had cost $3,000 but proved worth every penny in moments like this. "Your father will be part of your life," Isabella murmured, offering Sophia what she was urgently seeking, "but he'll earn his place through years of consistent presence rather than genetic entitlement. And your grandmother Victoria, well, she'll remain in Arizona where her bitterness can't poison your childhood with lessons about treating people like they're nothing." Through the window, Central Park stretched vast and complicated, full of paths that diverged and reconnected in patterns that looked random but followed careful design. Isabella's life had taken similarly unexpected routes, from tech billionaire to invisible housewife to vindicated CEO to single mother. But every turn had been her choice. Even the ones that looked like submission had been strategic positioning for moves her opponents never saw coming. Her phone buzzed with the news alert she'd been expecting. Mitchell and Associates announces restructuring under Chen leadership. Fraud victims to receive full restitution as company refocuses on ethical development. The company Derek's grandfather built would survive, but transformed into something that valued substance over appearance, earned success over borrowed glory, and integrity over exploitation. Rachel arrived an hour later with Thai food and the baby clothes she'd been stockpiling since Isabella's second trimester. But her smile when she saw her sister, confident, powerful, choosing grace over vengeance, contained pride that words couldn't adequately express. "You're letting him see Sophia," Rachel said, because somehow sisters always knew without being told. "In 6 months, supervised conditionally," Isabella confirmed, but her hand on her daughter's back moved in circles that communicated protection would always be her primary instinct. "He's been doing the work, therapy, honest employment, accountability for his role in creating the situation I had to dismantle. Sophia deserves to know if that work produces someone worth knowing." "And if it doesn't?" Rachel asked, settling onto the couch with pad thai and the comfortable intimacy of siblings who'd weathered storms together. "Then she'll learn a different lesson," Isabella said, adjusting Sophia's position with the instinctive competence she'd developed over 6 sleep-deprived days. "That biology doesn't guarantee relationship, that presence matters more than genetics, and that her mother built an empire, while people called her nothing, so she can build anything she imagines while people celebrate her everything." The sun set over Central Park, painting the nursery in shades of amber and rose, but Isabella watched Sophia's face cycle through newborn expressions, concentration, contentment, confusion, and saw the future she'd fought to protect becoming real in ways that transcended revenge or justice or vindication. Derek Mitchell had kicked her out on their anniversary to marry his mistress. Unaware his pregnant wife was the billionaire who owned his family's entire world. But the story that had started with cruelty and mockery was ending with possibility. Not reconciliation. Isabella had learned too much about her own worth to ever return to someone who'd only valued her after losing her, but space for Derek to become the father Sophia deserved, if he continued doing the work that transformation required. And if he didn't, Sophia would still have a mother who'd taught her the most important lesson Isabella had learned, that the people who call you nothing reveal everything about themselves and nothing about your worth. 6 months ago, Isabella had been homeless, publicly humiliated, and carrying a secret that would redefine every assumption her husband's family had built their identity upon. Tonight she sat in a penthouse she'd purchased with money she'd earned, holding a daughter who would grow up knowing her mother's strength wasn't loud but unstoppable, watching sunset paint possibility across a city that had witnessed her systematic dismantling of everything false and her careful construction of everything true. The champagne from that anniversary night remained unopened in her kitchen, a reminder that celebrations delayed weren't celebrations denied, just rescheduled for moments when everyone present actually deserved the toast. Someday, maybe when Sophia graduated college, or launched her first company, or simply turned 18 and asked to hear the full story, Isabella would open that bottle and explain that the best revenge isn't emotional or impulsive or cruel. It's patient, strategic, and ultimately focused on building something better from the rubble of what deserved to collapse. But tonight, revenge was just history, and the future was a 7-pound human who needed feeding every 2 hours and had already mastered the art of commanding absolute attention simply by existing. Just like her mother, who'd spent 5 years being invisible until the exact moment visibility served her purposes. Derek Mitchell learned too late that his pregnant wife was the billionaire who owned his world. But his daughter would grow up always knowing that her mother's worth had never depended on anyone else's recognition. It had simply waited, patient and powerful, for the perfect moment to be revealed. And that, Isabella thought, as Sophia's tiny hand wrapped around her finger with surprising strength, was the lesson worth teaching. Not how to destroy those who underestimate you, but how to build yourself so thoroughly that their estimation becomes completely irrelevant. The city lights flickered on across Manhattan, but Isabella's attention remained focused on the small human who'd been the catalyst for everything. The reason she'd tolerated mockery while gathering evidence, the motivation behind every strategic acquisition, and now the future she'd fought to protect becoming real in ways that transcended money or power or vindication. Sophia Chen Mitchell would grow up knowing her father had been given a chance at redemption, but that chance was earned through years of work rather than granted through genetic entitlement. She'd learned that her mother had been called nothing by people who were nothing without her, and that the appropriate response wasn't anger but systematic demonstration of everything they'd been too blind to see. And someday, when Sophia was old enough to understand, Isabella would tell her the whole story, not as a tale of revenge, but as a lesson about patience, preparation, and the quiet power of building something real while others celebrated illusions. But that conversation was years away, and tonight was simply about newborn breathing, sunset colors, and the recognition that the best victory isn't destroying your enemies. It's building a life so complete that their opinion becomes background noise to your daughter's first smile.